Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Takeup. Today we have episode 51, Q&A, layering density outlines and selecting stitches. Hello, everybody. This is Erich Campbell. I am here. It is 2:30 Mountain Time in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where I am from. Not currently in the beautiful and brilliant studios. As you know, I've been home for a while with everything that's going on. We've been staying socially distant and all the things that we've had to do. But we are here and on to run. I hate to say, sorry, folks. I did have to start a little late today, and I'm hoping we won't have any more trouble. But we did have some connection issues today. Earlier on in the Two Regular Guys podcast, where I produce the podcast and do all the button pushing in the background, I had a couple moments where the connection cut out and I couldn't stay on and couldn't be in control, which is a little scary. But today we're going to do our best to go ahead and have this discussion we started. Now, this particular episode, I'm doing a lot of Q&A. This is stuff that people have asked me about. These are things that I keep seeing over and over in my questions and comments, as people may or may not know. If you go to erichcampbell.com, there's a contact me form. I don't always answer immediately, but I do try to always answer. People ask me questions all the time here, social media. It's like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, wherever I am, you will find that I am being asked questions about embroidery. And so some of these questions have come up and are going to be what we're talking about today. So it's going to be a little bit looser, a little chattier. I'm also going to bring up some designs on screen and talk about them. But if you have questions about the topics at hand, I'd really love for you to jump in, especially we're talking about things like density, fills with holes cut in them, satin stitches, and what we do to try and work with borders around text, borders in general, borders and outlining, big deal there. We're going to talk a little bit about compensation and things in that realm. But in general, we're going to be doing Q&A, talking about technical stuff today. And like I said, a little bit looser show, a little bit more chatty show, a little bit more me talking than, and a little bit more of describing things, showing images, and not directly related to like one article, one thing that I can show you. However, that said, I do still have the links list up, and I'm going to go ahead and show you guys that on screen. In the first comments, you're going to see a links list. There are several articles in there that will be helpful, because part of what we may or may not get to is talking about selecting stitches in art. I foresee this is something we're going to talk about over and over and over again. Very likely, I'm going to do some more art interpretation. One of the things I've been asked, and I've got a couple different people who I will credit with this when we start doing these episodes, is to take a piece of art and show why I made the decisions I made about what embroidery, stitches, objects, digitizing elements I would do, how I drew my shapes. So we will do some breakdowns like that. We will do some work in that same realm. So what I'm going to say is that may not be but toward the end. The good thing is I've got some cool articles, some from my historical stack, pretty deep in printware, some that are more recent, talking about things like selecting stitch types, digitizing with dimension, things that I've taught entire workshops on since then, that may be very useful to you guys. So the links list, like I always say, links list is not ideal. You can't see everything that's on without clicking through. What you will find is a lot of really useful information that relates. And the first couple of things that are on there, I'm gonna go ahead and pull it up on screen just because why not? We can talk about that briefly before I say hi to everybody. You're going to see a couple of articles that are very classic that I've used over and over and over to kind of teach people, because honestly, though I've rewritten them, these are still kind of the canonical examples for me of saying this pretty simply. Distortion, digitizing part 1 and 2, talking about pull distortion, push compensation, push distortion over at MrXStitch.com. These articles are probably one of the simpler ways I've seen it done, in fact, seen it discussed. Yes, I wrote them. I'm not saying they're great. I'm saying that they do certainly help people. And I've had people come back to me and say, after they looked at this, pull and push made sense. These are important because when we're talking about any of this stuff, whether it's borders, whether it's how we handle stitch types or drawing, all of it's going to hinge on dealing with distortion. You're going to see this dimensional embroidery digitizing. If you've ever been in my dimensional digitizing class, this is the original article that kind of inspired that class. And it's just it's kind of the kernel of what eventually became that entire workshop class. And I thought I'd let people go ahead and have a look at that. And we always talk about breaking things up in dimension. It's the original kind of granddaddy article of all that stuff. And you'll also see that we have the Ghost in the Embroidery Machine post here. Stitch types and embroidery digitizing goes briefly into selecting stitch types. Like I said, we may not get too far into that today. And this last one here from May 19 Printwear, like I said, ways back, but this one is like a digitizing 101 that really goes into selecting stitch types. So if I don't get to that in the course of this discussion today, by all means, we can go ahead and take a look at the links list, and you're going to have lots more information to kind of consume at your leisure when you have time. So with that, let's go ahead and see who's out in the comments and say hi. Number one, I have to say thank you for everybody who hung through while I was having trouble getting started today. So Curtis, hello from Kansas. Hello to you, Curtis. Happy to have you here. Cindy King out in Texas. Good afternoon. Ready for another great lesson. Here's hoping. Here's hoping I stay online and nothing goes wrong. But certainly I'll try and teach you some stuff, or at least I'm going to show you some designs that are from different eras of my career, and I may tear up some of the things I say or that I have done in what I say, but I will certainly discuss the topics that I'm talking about here. And stay in from Sweden. Hi from Sweden, and hi to you out here. Jeff said, you're really going to miss it. Hello, excited to learn. Not going to miss it. Hopefully there's something for you to learn today, man. We'll see. We'll have to talk about it. But glad to have you in. If you haven't seen what's going on at MNerd over there with Jeff, go check it out. Embroidery Nerd group is really great. Good evening to Frankie. Got you there. I think that's Frank from the UK. The picture looks good. Lisa Shaw, educator in her own right, who has done a really cool, she released a class over for the Embrilliance folks, for Stitch artists, an introductory digitizing class. If you're over on that list, you should check that out. It's over on the blog posts from Embrilliance, and a really great introduction if you really haven't digitized and just want to get started. So that was cool. Really great to see that here. And honestly, what everybody loves to see, more of Lisa Shaw teaching. Greg Johnson, good afternoon from Boston. Ready for more great information? Great to have you in. Greg. Anthony says, good morning. Good morning to you, sir. Justin Armenta, digitizer in his own right. Good to see you here too as well. John says, another great episode. I hope so. Hi, man. Happy to have you here, John. And Frank. Yep, Frank is there. Good evening, all. Ashley King says, hi. Happy to be there. Ramona, sweet. Thank you. Glad to be here. Sandy, good afternoon. Good afternoon to you too. Regina, hello. Hi, Regina. Happy to have you there. Jeff says, is there a singular place to see all your content? Yes and no, and I'm going to work on that more. It was and has been erichcampbell.com, but the truth of the matter is I have not kept up with archiving everything. There's a few different places to go. I would say erichcampbell.com is a huge one. If you see me there, go to my LinkedIn page. My LinkedIn page has publications up to a certain date. They kind of turned off the ability to see the publications list on the front page of my bio, and I stopped updating it then because for a while there it was completely gone, and then now it came back after a while. During that period of time, I stopped updating publications, but that has historical publications way, way back. Not all the links will necessarily work to the old stuff from Stitches Magazine, but it did have a lot of my magazine articles there, and this is something I really need to work on this year, and honestly, it's just been a matter of time. What I'll say is, luckily, because Erich is a weird name with that CH when paired with Campbell, if you say Erich Campbell Embroidery, you'll find a ton of it, but here are the places to look for the most of it. You're going to find a lot on erichcampbell.com. I would say go to Images Magazine. If you search for Erich or you look in the digital issues, all the past issues for like the last 2 years, I'm in every issue of Images Magazine out in the UK. If you look at GraphicsPro.com, I'm both in some Graphics Pro magazines, and you'll find in their digital archives, they do have archives of Printwear magazine. If you sign up for their free, for their actual free subscription, you'll be able to get all digital archives. This is something to work on. Hold me accountable to that. Keep asking me about this because it's something that I have to get on. So there is no one singular place yet, but find that. And also MrXStitch.com. I have a column there that I admittedly has been fallow for a while. I have not been working on it lately, but I did some of these earlier articles that really have kind of borne out over the years. And those are all at MrXStitch.com. The column is called Ghost in the Embroidery Machine, which I may have discussed before, but we'll certainly get back on and talk about that. So no, I don't have one place yet, but it's something to look for. And if you're missing something, looking for something, can't find it, definitely ask me over there at Campbell.com. The other place I'd say is go search my name on YouTube, because some of the stuff I can't put all together, but you'll find first, if you're here on YouTube with me, if you're on my channel on YouTube, you're going to find playlists. And one of the playlists are all of my guest appearances. I've done my best to get as many of those guest appearances from YouTube on there. So you're going to find me doing webinars with Madeira. I know Jeff has been a fan of some of those webinars. One of the 3D foam ones is one that a lot of people say is where they learn to 3D foam. So Madeira has a few of those. Stalls TV. I went out to Stalls TV a while back, and I actually recorded at Stalls TV a few things about embroidery and business with Stalls. So that was cool. And you're going to I will throw myself in there on that list. So not only do you have the Takeup as a playlist, so all 51 episodes of the Takeup are there, you're also going to have a playlist of all of my kind of guest appearances on anything video. The other thing I'll say is that if you look on SoundCloud, believe it or not, if you look up my name on SoundCloud, I've tried to collect as many podcasts that publish on SoundCloud into another playlist where there are podcast episodes. So I've been on Graphics Pro. I've been on stuff from Promo Kitchen. If you don't know Promo Kitchen, it's like a promotional products group that they do really cool work. I've been on them from doing promo chat with them on Wednesdays on Twitter. So it's like a lot of decorators and promotional products people. So you'll find that there too. But you are absolutely right. I need to put more of this stuff together because I'm kind of everywhere. You'll find me all over the place. Point of fact, there are magazines that don't exist. There are things that are still hard to find. And I probably need to build a giant library of all these things for you guys. But let me go ahead and say hi to the last few people, and then we'll start into our topic today. So let's start here and say, howdy, y'all. Howdy, Missy. Happy to see you here. Mike saying hello. Hello, Mike. Rona says, Jeff is so smart. Yeah, he is smart. He is smart. And he certainly absorbs information and gets it back out there. So definitely go check out the stuff he's doing as well. Frank, you had problems with YouTube? Yeah, like I said, today we've had a lot of technical issues. So if we're having technical issues, I certainly apologize for that. Jeff Kuhn says, hello. Hey, Jeff. Yeah, and once again, time is something we need more of. We all need more time. Yeah, absolutely. Though I will say I need more time management, and I need to work on my priorities with this stuff. Absolutely. And Jeff also says, from the Madeira episode, I believe, if you go look that up, guys, Madeira had some webinars. And if you want more of those, please contact Madeira. I'm willing to do them if they want to do them. But that's where I learned 3D Puff. I love that because you do some good 3D Puff work. Tom Farr saying hello as well. And Jesus says hello. All right, man. So with that, let's go to the actual meat of what we want to discuss today, right? Here are the few things we wanted to talk about. Certainly, we're going to talk a little bit about density, overlapping, things like that. And it's something that I really want to discuss in light of how you put a design together. It's something we've had issues with many, many times. And it's something that I certainly have talked with people about. You know, I want to talk about that. Certainly, we're going to talk about borders and outlines and overlapping. In the spec of trying to deal with satin stitch borders on text, especially because it's something I'm seeing over and over, especially when we're talking about kind of sports work, mascot work, classic basketball or baseball names with tails that have the multicolor borders on them. A lot of this stuff can cause issues if people don't quite know how to parse or break up that border. And I'm going to say there's multiple ways to handle it, multiple ways to sequence things. But I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things I've taught people recently who are having problems with their borders. And then, like I said, I would like to transition some into stitch types and how to select stitch types. So definitely going to watch what you guys say in the comments as well. Like I said, hey, I'll say hi to a couple people. Heidi's here. Hi, Heidi. And Mike saying, hey, Inlay going to be out, watching the replay on that one. You know, hope you're well too, Mike, and glad to have you on the replay. Glad to have you whenever. But anybody who is here, if you have comments, whether they are fully related or not, or questions whether they're fully related or not that you want me to answer while we're here, today is a Q&A kind of session. So please kick in. Reciprocators, jump in on the show and absolutely, let's talk about these things directly. But what I will go ahead and do, I'm going to grab that screen over here. There's that links list again. But let's go ahead and run through a couple of things. First, I am going to show you guys a couple of things that I already mentioned. Here's that Distortion and Digitizing article that talks about pull compensation. One of the things I'm just going to mention on this is overlapping. The first thing I want to tell everybody is that overlapping is necessary. Half of the time I see people having problems with things where it comes to registration or density. A lot of the times people are worried about density when they don't need to be and not worried about it where they should be. They're stacking up too much density to get coverage in a fill stitch, but they're cutting things out of fills when they're dropping a normal text over a fill, right? And I actually think I'm going to jump into software to show you this if I can. So let's go ahead and just show you a classical example of this in a company logo. I think it makes sense to show you this instead of just talking about it. One of the things that I keep having people do is tell me, okay, I want to knock out all of the stitches behind lettering because I want it to be less dense. And before I go fully into this description, let's just talk about this for a second. There is more than one kind of density that we're worried about. When we talk about density, we all kind of think about it in 2 dimensions, and 2-dimensional density is a real thing. We're talking about coverage, and we're worried about how close together stitches are, right? Are the stitches closer together? Are they further apart? Less density, more density in a given area. That's all that density means. It's the spacing between rows of stitching. The thing is, we forget. We're thinking about this two-dimensional thing of density, these rows of stitches that are packing together side by side. What we're forgetting most of the time is that stitches are objects that poke through the fabric, and we don't think about the three-dimensional density, which is how we are packing through fabric together, and when we're running things on top of each other, that we are packing stitch penetrations in together closely. So what I'm going to posit is this, that overlapping sometimes isn't the worst thing on earth, and that it's usually better to leave fill stitch underneath most satin stitches until they get huge. And especially because most of the people are worried about two different things. They are either worried about bunching too much together so that we get like a difficult surface on the back of the embroidery, or that it's too thick. And they do think of it in 3 dimensions in this case, too thick, too bunchy, too bulky. That's one thing. The second thing they worry about is things like technical issues with the embroidery, with it causing like push distortion, problems like that. You know, it comes with issues, right? It comes out with issues. And by the way, I love this comment. Sometimes you guys get me in the comments and I squirrel out to the one side and see what's going on. Rowan says, I need a third hand, one for the fabric, one for the fill stitch, one for the satin. Yeah, I do. I need more hands to gesture at you guys. I know I talk with my hands a lot, but I think it does actually illustrate things very simply. But yeah, the other kind of density they're worried about is this. They're worried about literally trying to get coverage on top of each other. So there's that density. And then they're not really thinking about that three-dimensional density. And the other problem isn't density at all. They're saying density, but what they're saying is stitch count. Stitch count. So the first thing I'm going to do is, like I said, I want to bring this up and talk to you just briefly about this, because I've had several people ask me, hey, how do I knock this fill out behind this text? Should I knock this out? When do you knock it out? When do you not knock it out? And the thing is, it's not super simple to say exactly a measurement. Don't get me wrong. Sometimes when I'm teaching stitch types, I'll just tell you like, hey, I'm usually going to select, if I've got a narrow column of some sort that's in my art, some sort of, you know, rectangular narrow object that's usually going to be a satin stitch if it's under 10 millimeters or something. That's not the case necessarily with this. You have to make decisions about how you're going to break things up. And a lot of it has to do with efficiency of how a design fills. And it has to do with that three-dimensional density I talked about, having a lot of stitch penetrations all in one place. Because that's what we don't want. One of the things we're having trouble with when we have this density issue, especially when we're talking about bulking it up and having thread break, stuff like that, is not necessarily that we have thread laying on top of itself. Because if you had big giant satin stitches and there's one little satin stitch inside of a larger satin stitch, that density, we might have some issue with buildup on the top and bottom. Remember that we have bobbin on the other side, just the same as we have, you know, if there's stitching up here, there's bobbin on the back. So we might have buildup on both sides, but it isn't causing the same kind of problems as we have when we have all the stitch penetrations lining up all in one spot close together, or tons of stitch penetrations all bunched in. And I'm going to go ahead and go with Jeff on this. We're going to talk about that briefly. I think of 3D satins and what a 3D satin stitch is. Just to clarify this for everybody, a 3D satin stitch, as posited, I believe this is generally Wilcom. It's not in every software. But when someone refers to a 3D satin stitch, and we're not talking about foam here, so this isn't something that has EVA foam underneath it, which is every other 3D foam design that you've seen. A 3D satin stitch is essentially multiple passes of satin stitch with narrow satin stitches under wider satin stitches on top. So you have like a narrow satin stitch here, then a wider one on top, and then another wider one on top. And this goes in 3 passes. And by the time it's done, you have built up, it's almost like couching. If you know hand embroidery, something where something is stuck underneath it, it's padded. Well, imagine we're building up a satin stitch, then a wider one, and then a wider one still. So the stitch penetration points aren't lining up, but what we're getting is bulk. So on the top front of the garment, we have bulk. The problem with this is to remember that on the back of the garment, we also have 3 passes of bobbin. And to illustrate this, one of the things we have to worry about with density in this way, right? We're not really talking about density. We're talking about like build up. The one thing that's troublesome about this, we're not going to get thread breaks from that. We're not going to have issues with, bunching up a bunch of stitch penetrations together. So like I said, you're cutting thread on top of itself. You're breaking thread because you're just punching through a ton of density in one area. What you will have is buildup. And the problem is that on the back, you're going to have the same amount of three-dimensional stitching, kind of, the bobbin thread's thinner, but still, you're going to have that 3 layers of satin stitch on the back of the bobbin as well. And what I've seen people have issues with is they have a tight-fitting hat, and they'll throw a 3D satin image or a logo on the front of this thing will have a text or a big satin stitch letter, and you literally have the letter pushing into your head as much as it's pushing forward out of the plane of the hat. So you're going to lift your hat and your forehead's going to be branded with the with the logo that's there. So there is something about worrying about building up a bunch of material. You can have that issue. Another thing that's really classically a problem is when people start putting really fine detail in an area. And I know this sounds funny, but there is one part of an image where I see this the most. And this is where people start to draw eyes on people or animals. We have a small animal rendered somewhere, and they very clearly want to make sure we have the pupil and the iris, and we have a line outside of it, which is usually not possible in teeny tiny renditions on hats. We've got someone's head that is the size of a dime. The chances of getting all of that together or putting color inside of an eye are very low. And so people start trying to run, they fill the eye with the satin stitch, then they run details on top of it over and over and over again. And when people do that, you tend to build up a lot of density, and you have a bunch of stitch penetrations all in one point. You try and jam a needle through it, and you get thread breaks, and you get these nodes, these lumps in the back of the hat, in the back of the garment. So that's one of the things that happens. People worry about that, and that's correct. The thing is, when you're worrying about, like, say, stitch count, or you're worrying about building up the bulk, you're not going to have as much trouble with, let's say, thread breaks and the kind of stitch penetration jams when you have a filled area with a satin stitch set of lettering on top of it, which is the classic use case for this, right? So let's go ahead and bring up, once again, this logo. This is a logo directly off of my production runs. Looks a little funky, right? Well, we all know push and pull compensation is going to help us here. Certainly, you know, that things are going to get a little bit thinner, they're going to get clearer, the holes are going to open, things are going to look a little bit better. So let's see, I'm going to try and bring up pointer focus. Yes, I have pointer focus. So pointer focus is an app that gives me that little ring so you can see my pointer a little bit better. But let's go ahead and take a look at this logo for a second. What you're going to see is one method of outlining. Now, this doesn't have a tightly contoured outline it, but people are saying, okay, if I want to outline text, yes, this is a shield shape, but this is very similar to what you might do if you were outlining it directly. One method for outlining text, and this certainly doesn't have the nice contours around it and everything, but one method for outlining text is to put a solid fill behind it and a satin stitch border on the whole thing. There is nothing wrong with this method of outlining text. And somebody will tell me, okay, it's a tremendous amount of buildup or stitch count or whatever. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. A nice fill stitch that has a balanced density and decent underlay under it and has a nice long stitch length. I tend to go 4.5 mils and above. I don't like to do little tiny fill stitches, especially in this case. The stitch count is kind of negligible to some degree. There is one thing I'll especially say is I don't think I would ever tell anyone for any reason to knock out density, knock out fill stitch behind tiny letters. And it's the thing that I see over and over again is people using really slim letters, really slim satin stitches, and being incredibly concerned about the overlap, about the stitch count or the density. And so they start to knock things out. And as an illustration of why I think this doesn't make sense, a couple things that I'm going to show you. As we see in here, there's really, there's no issue with density. It's only got one small layer. Plus, look at how low density these letters are. Small letters, as you get small enough and you have decent underlay under them, you can actually lighten that density, sometimes 15, 20% without any problems. And yes, this was made for 40 weight thread. This is not thin thread. So you're going to actually get a decent amount of coverage there. And this piece does look good. I unfortunately didn't have a picture of this piece, but I wanted to show it because it showed a few different things. And this is one of the styles of pieces that I had somebody refer to me recently. And what you can see is that I have a regular satin stitch on top of this fill, but think about this. I've got nice long stitches that are offset in the fill. They're not all going to line up. The stitch penetration points are not going to all line up. They are stair-stepped like a brick, like a brick pattern, tatami pattern, specifically in the fill. So they're not going to line up. We're not going to drop the needle all in the same place over and over again. And then I have these nice satin stitches, and these satin stitches only have most of their penetration points lining up on the edge. And as long as these have balanced density, which they do, they have nice light densities. They're not crazy dense. And they're using what we sometimes call the German underlay. We have that edge walk with a double zigzag on top, or there's multiple ways it's called. But whatever the structure is called in your software, you can see that it has that dimensional underlay there. And the other thing I'm going to go ahead and do, let's go ahead and drop this out just for a second so you can see that. Let's lock and hide that piece so we can see this a little bit better. But yeah, if we don't have that selected, you can see that that underlay is just a nice double zig on top of some contour, and that's all that's there to hold up this big wide satin stitch. So we're not going to drop a bunch of stitches in the same place. And as you can see, I'm definitely not knocking anything else out here. And you're going to see this. What I do worry about with overlaps and density, what I do worry about is when I get over like 3 layers. Once I have 3 layers, if I have 2 layers of satin stitch and a fill behind it, I am going to get really concerned. I am going to start looking at what I'm doing. I don't definitely want 4 or more layers coming together. I'm going to try and cut that out. And what you're going to see is here. If you look at where this border is, I'm going to turn that black back on so you can see it. Here's that black layer. And people are going to say, okay, how do you handle it? Are you bringing that fill stitch all the way out to the far edge? And though I think you probably could, I will say when I have a multicolor outline like this with a fill inside of it, I'm generally going to knock this back. So you'll see this fill just about lines up here over to this edge of the outer outline, but this black outline that goes on top of it and covers them both, it only goes halfway on both sides and it has enough clearance to do so. Now, you can't do that on every thin outline. You may have to play with your outlines, but you will see that I do try and maintain no more than 2 layers of full density coverage stitching. I would totally run straight stitches or details somewhere on top of that and not be too worried about it. But when we're talking about coverage stitching, that can be an issue. So what I will show you, though, is this. We have this piece that doesn't have the knockout because this is something somebody specifically brought to me. They wanted to knock out behind a tiny text, behind satin stitches that were in their design because they were worried about stitch count. And here's the thing. You probably can't see it very well here, but the stitch count down here for this entire piece, if I unselect that, and let me go ahead and bring this back so we can see this piece. The stitch count here is 9,429 stitches for this piece, right? If we go look at another piece, and this is one where I have punched out, and I'll show you, I made that yellow a little darker so you can see it. I punched this out. I punched out behind this tiny lettering. So I did a subtract, essentially. If you guys are familiar with vector graphics, I subtracted that lettering out of that background. When I did so, I knocked out that density, right? What do I end up with? Number one, our stitch count over here is now 10,116. Stitch count went up. Why did it go up? It went up because now when we're going through this design, what you're going to see is that the design has to travel all over. First thing is, if I have an edge run and I left it automatic, it's going to edge run those inside holes. Awesome, right? We might want to turn that off. The second thing is, as it travels around to make the underlay, it's traveling over and over trying to get down inside of all these little gaps and cracks inside of these holes, right? Then when we go to do this stitching, the top stitching, it's going to run up and then back down and back down and back down to try and fill all these little gaps between the letters. I've now traveled all over the place trying to get there. So travel stitching is built up, the underlay stitching is built up, and then the top stitching has travels in it trying to get back to all these little nooks and crannies. Meaning that if I leave it automatic, which most people are going to do, these automatic settings are going to have that thing become bulkier and more dense and by far worse to run than just leaving those fill stitches in there. A nice balanced fill with satin stitches on it is nothing to be afraid of. The other thing that's going to be happening if you just knock it out, because a lot of people will do this as a graphical operator. They will take these things as if they were vector graphics and punch the top layer out of the bottom layer. If you just knock it out on something small like this, the other thing you're going to have is issues with pull distortion, where you're going to get gaps, because these little stitches are going to pull apart. The 2 sets of stitches that are here that are just barely touching are going to want to pull apart from each other as they narrow, as the natural pull distortion happens. And if you're not adjusting for it, they're going to pull apart. And the funny thing is, on something this small, when we are down to 1 millimeter, 2 millimeters, honestly, a lot of things under 4 mils, I'm not going to cut anything out. And that's really where I'll even start thinking about cutting a hole in something, is when it's 4 millimeters or wider. And like I said, mostly not, as you can see from the text above. When we have something this small, if you adjusted the pull compensation to cover that, they'd be touching anyway. Leave the fill in behind it. Now, I think most of the people who are here, you guys are probably not going to have problems with that. But if you ever have an issue where you're punching a hole out of something that is there because you're worried about density behind it, the chances are you may or may not save stitches. Now, I'm going to tell you this. I could have done this ahern differently. The pieces this were going on, these were heavy jackets that had a fair amount of texture, and I wanted to get a good coverage. They were also they were a range of colors. And admittedly, this is real production. I wasn't wanting to try and do separate designs for all of them because we had customer supply stuff and a large range of colors. So I have a border that could come on and off, and that did save stitches. The white border can come on and off if you are on a light garment. But on some garments, they wanted that white border even with the color that was there not showing because they considered it to be part of the logo. I don't love having tons and tons of borders on things, but they like the colorway as part of the logo, right? In general, it's not something I would do for everything. So you're going to see that that's something you can do. I didn't want to then have coverage issues on the lighter garments, especially because it went full range from white to black. So I left that fill in and I didn't do a ton of work on each individual piece for it. But what I'm going to say is like, definitely, no matter what, you just don't want to knock this stuff out. As we see when we zoom in tight, it's a mess. Also, there's a ton. If I turn on stitch penetration points on this, you can see them. Because these are fill stitches in between here, instead of what could have been done is running satins in between here and breaking it up into shapes itself, which I'm going to show you later with borders. Even if you were going to do something like this, which at this size or scale I would never do, it's got stitch penetrations inside of each of the fills. You can see all the tons of stitching that's running back and forth. Oh, sorry, guys. Because of the travels and the underlay and everything else, and especially if you leave on your automated settings, which could be the best settings for the rest of the fill that's involved, it's not going to look its best. So let's kind of transition from this, though. This does lead to some other stuff. What I will say, though, is this. The three-dimensional density causes issues, and part of this also hinges on throwing too much density at things for coverage because it can cause issues with the garment. We talked about that three-dimensional density, that pushing and pulling that goes in those dimensions. Here's the other reason I like to think about three-dimensional density, and this is the fabric. And Ramona kind of was joking around about, I need another hand. I'm actually going to show you an image from one of my classes, one of my slide decks here, and I'll go ahead and put this in presentation mode so you can actually see what's going on. But let's jump this out. Excess density causes three-dimensional distortion, and I'm going to call myself out on this one. This is coverage density. This is where we are packing a bunch of stuff in. The thing is, this will also happen when you punch a bunch of stuff all in one area with the stitch penetrations, right? So part of what we have with what I call 3D distortion or 3D density problems. Number one, when we have a bunch of needle points all landing in the same place, we can get thread breaks, especially layer after layer. And if we have a bunch of density already in place, more than the coverage we need, and we start dropping stuff on top, we can get thread breaks, we can get distortion there, and we get those, like I said, those bumps and lumps, and that's from thread building up. The other kind of distortion is this. When we have something soft, something pliable, we have a stretchy garment, a performance garment, and we throw down excessive fill stitch, we throw down excessive stitches of any kind. As it builds up, the fabric has nowhere to go. If garments cover your body, that means they're pretty full, right? They have all of the threads they need to be a solid piece of material to cover you and not show through. They're not a mesh. When we jam all of these needles through this stuff, the only place this stuff has to go, you can see when I stick my fingers through the other fingers, since we're joking around about that, as you see, these fingers have to spread apart. If I throw more and more thread and jam more and more threads in between these existing threads, where does that stuff go? If it has to spread apart, well, as it spreads apart, next to it are all of its neighbors in the fabric. What's eventually going to happen? It's not going to go this way forever. It can't. It's a garment. It's a solid piece. It's going to go this way or this way. It's going to warp. We're going to get either what we call like cupping or dishing. And what you're going to see here, you get the old thread taco, where your design either punches in or pulls out. And what you can see about this one is caused by excessive fill stitching. And where this stitching is, I have a gradient, and it's a gradient that wasn't done correctly. It's from early in my career, and the gradient was done by throwing down a full coverage fill of the first color and then throwing down a gradient of the second color on top of it where we had spreading out. We spread out the density as we go. The problem is there was too much coverage there. And even if I did double gradients, sometimes this can happen where people use the automatic gradients in both directions. We can talk about that if you want to talk about color blending. I've got other shows where we've discussed that. We can also go deep into color blending at some point. But the problem is when you drop these stitches in, what you can see is on the angle of the fill, say this is the angle of the fill, as it spreads out and out like this, that's where that hump develops. And you can see really directly in the angle of the fill, that's where the ridge is at and where it makes that taco shape. And often people will have this with, or will have circular designs. You get a dish or a cup, and it's because they actually have a bunch of stuff in the center. It's usually with patches and badges where we have a central material, like we have a state seal or something. We have a seal in the center that has a ton of detail. Outside of it is a filled area that doesn't have a lot of detail, and then some text on the farthest outside. And what you actually have is less density on the outside, and as we get toward the center with all the detail, they've smashed a bunch of density in together on top of itself until it causes that puckering, that spreading of all the material, and it spreads out and you get a dish or a warped shape. This one, because all of the fill is in one angle, because as you know with stitch blending, if you want threads to blend together, the fills all have to be in one angle. Well, because of that all being one angle, it's going to warp, it's going to cup in that angle. And so this one is convex, but if you punched it down with your finger, it popped inside because that is way more density than it needs to be. I'm gonna go ahead and answer a couple questions while we're here, folks. So let me pull myself back up. And first, go with Jeff here. He says, how many times in your experience can you drop the needle in the same place like whip satin? Here's the thing. With whip satin stitches, if it's not on top of a bunch of other density or they aren't too close together, I haven't had too much trouble with 7 or even 9 passes. The only problem I have with that is it punches holes. The more time we drop that thing in the same space, whip satin stitch, if you guys don't know, whip stitch or multi-count satin stitches are where on satins, we know that satins have a straight bar and then an angled return in the straight bar, which each of the straight bars is stitched multiple times. It has to be an odd number so that the continues to travel in the front. So it's like 1, 2, 3 stitches and then down and then over to the next straight bar in satin, right? Well, whip stitches like that, I have frequently run them up to, like I said, seven stitches. Pretty fine. I don't find any problems with it. What I will say is as we continue to do it, the holes on the end get bigger. And if you do a bunch of whip stitch on a really light piece of material, if you pull it up to the light, you will see at the ends of those holes that it does get pretty big. The holes can get pretty big. The other thing is to remember that we're still dealing with density. If we look at a linear inch or a linear centimeter, whichever way you want to do it, of this satin stitch column. So say we have the satin stitch column here, the whip stitch column, and we're looking at that and we look at that linear inch, depending on how you want it. For me, I'm trying to usually shoot for a density that's close to the same number of stitches per linear inch that I would have for a normal full density with the same thread. Now, that does give a slightly sparser look, but most of the time when I'm using whip stitch, I'm using it specifically to try and get a more sparse hand-stitched look where it looks like I'm stitching with big floss threads instead of thinner threads. And when you're doing that, I think that the gaps at the edge are part of the look. If you are just trying to make it look lumpy, I mean, you could put tighter densities, but then remember that you are also combating the normal coverage density being pretty high. So in my experience, that's usually not the problem. The largest problem I have is they'll put together, like I said, like a seal that has a person or an image on it, or like a head, like a coin. And in the middle of said seal, they'll do satin stitch eye with the satin stitch cheek and the satin stitch head on top of a fill already. So now we got our 2 layers. And then they start trying to trace a bunch of straight stitches. And here's the other thing, short stitches. Using tons of little short stitches, yes, they're not building up because a straight stitch doesn't build up excess density on top of something. It's only going to build as many passes as it has. However, imagine this, the same centimeter of stitches, if you use short stitches, little tiny stitches, 1 millimeter stitches, now we have 10 penetration points and we've put 10 little wedges through our garment. Whereas if we had 2 millimeter stitches, now there's only 5 in that same linear area. So in that case, that's the other place we see tons of problems with this kind of density is when you're doing detailed work like black work or engraving style work where we're drawing in little details. When you are drawing in little details on a design and you're zoomed in tight, you're not paying attention to how long your stitches are, people will start to drop tiny, tiny stitches while they're trying to draw every wrinkle around an eye. We're trying to draw every hair in a mustache. We're trying to draw every leaf on a tree, and we're drawing outlines around every single piece of it. And when we do, the small stitches start the problem. And we also end up with just jamming multiple layers on top of each other because you can eventually, if you draw all over an area repeatedly, eventually you will drop a ton of stitches in the same area. For me, it's more about the overall area than the one spot. It's not that I'm looking for one spot. It's that I'm looking for excessive density in the area and to see if I've got a ton of stitch points all in one space, especially once we start to have layering, then you do get nodes, you get thread breaks, and short stitches are absolutely one of the places where that happens. And it really happens in doing straight stitch outline detail. That is absolutely an issue. So that's something that you certainly have to look at that. Cindy says, what about the small text looking nice and crisp? That is a function of underlay and density and to some degree stitch angle. The other thing you have to worry about is stitch angle, and I can pull up that design that I had up. Let's take a look and see if I can grab that real quick. this stuff looked reasonably crisp, but what you're going to see is, and let's pull up the one that doesn't have the huge gaps in it. What you're going to see is that I have tried to avoid the angle lining up. Let me go ahead and pull this up on screen for you. Apparently that didn't go. There we go. What you're going to see is that as much as I can, I've tried to avoid the stitches lining up directly, where you're going to see I've got this angle here, and I'm trying to avoid the angles lining up exactly so that the stitches fall in. And in case, I would look at this one and say I probably could have hiked that stitch angle up just a little bit. I could have probably changed it a bit, had it tilt a little bit more, as you guys are seeing it, a little bit more to this angle so that we would have had less interaction. When stitches line up, just like in blending, they sink in. So if you have a fill stitch, you got little stitches on top of it, yes, small lettering on top of the silo stitch will want to sink. If the stitches line up perfectly, like the stitch angles on these returns line up with the angle of these stitches, or especially if you've got a completely horizontal stitch and normal satin stitch text, then every straight horizontal line is going to pull in more and try and sink into the garment or into the fill stitch. And it's only going to stay up by force of having underlay under it. So you have like a rail that is holding it on. Here's our underlay stitch, and our stitches are sitting on top of it, but they can still pull down very narrow. And that may be an issue where you can use pull compensation to work on it. The problem is if you do compensation equally on all the strokes, then if you look at these vertical strokes that are here, these vertical strokes are grabbing onto that other angle. Let's say we had our stitch angles like this. These vertical strokes are coming across and grabbing onto it, and they'll stay bigger and fatter. So it does cause some issues, certainly. So it's definitely an issue to try and deal with. Underlay as a balance, and then your stitch angles, you should try not to let your stitch angles line up with the text. So that's certainly a thing to worry about. But yeah, that's usually what it has to do with that. And let's go ahead and do a couple more comments while we're here, and then I'll jump into borders, and we'll see. We might not get into a lot of stitch selection. I think I'll talk about it briefly, probably go into a little bit of bonus time, but I really think selecting stitches and interpreting art is going to be a series where I may actually bring in designs and talk about it, and we'll talk. We may even have you guys show me some designs you have, and we'll talk about puzzling those out. But that's something to discuss. Let's bring in a couple more of these. Justin says, sometimes most stitches, more problems. You know, a lot, a lot of the time. Here's what I'll say. My practice, or at least the way I like to be, I'm going to show you designs from early on in my career where I am not there yet. But my practice and where I like to be is to have what I call stitch consciousness, which is to use every stitch I need and no stitches I don't. Lighter densities, lighter hand, it makes the garments flow better. It makes there's less density issue as far as distortion and 3D distortion, cupping, things like that. I'm always trying to hit the lightest target density I have and still have nice coverage. And that goes pretty much everywhere. Excepting, you know, there are some times where we need more density. There are times where coverage absolutely demands some more density. There are things that we're going to do, like 3D foam, that demand more density for cutting edges. But I am still trying to work on that. And here's, I'm going to go ahead and bring this up just as a general comment. I'm not going to be able to give you a number here, but Fanny says, the so-called regular cotton is so difficult to determine density for. Any tips on that? What weight or type would correspond to that auto fabric choice? Napkin cotton, shirt cotton, bedsheet cotton. This is really tough. What I'm going to say is most of the time when I see people having problems with this, where it's like bedsheet cotton or quilter's cotton or something like that, they're using an incredibly thin material with a less stable stabilizer because they don't want to see it on the back. They use like tearaway stabilizers, stuff like that, and it causes issues. Because you need a stable surface, you need to be able to hoop, or they're floating it. And I understand people like to float garments, but the thing is, when you float something, it's shifting. There's a reason why embroidery has been done in a tight timbre hoop forever. It's because the hoop keeps the material from shifting around. And what I say is there are some things where if you want a big, heavy design with or a design that has a lot of satin stitches that have a lot of pull because they all line up in the same angle, you have all of these satin stitches lining up and crimping down on the material in the middle. On really light material, you may have to make compromises between the amount of coverage you get and not having ripples, or the amount of stabilization you use and what you can get out of the design. Forever, I'm seeing someone bring a single layer of quilter's cotton and then throwing a full density design that has full density fills and mass amounts of borders and satin stitches, and then it has, you know, detail on top of it. Super heavy designs are going to cause distortion because we cannot get away from the fact that we're jabbing thousands of holes and putting thousands of little tense loops of thread through that piece of material. So what I'd say for density settings, also the other thing is, you said regular cotton. The problem is that there is no regular cotton. If we go to the fabric store and pick up cotton, it's going to have different, and this is the same with garments in the commercial world. It is the same. Every time somebody goes, oh, what's the setting for a polyester polo? Grab 5 polyester polos of different specs or different, like, is this a dry fit? Is this something that's made for athletic wear? Or is it just happen to be a polyester polo and it's a cheap poly polo that's just kind of a normal knit? They're going to stretch differently. They're going to have different kind of different things you do. What I would say is this: stabilize with something that cuts away. I know people don't like to, but for really light materials, I like to have a cutaway material. You can do other things to make it work. I find long-term, you want to maintain this thing, especially something washable that is causing issues. The other thing is that the project guides in any software, they're good. They're good starts because materials differ, because you may have different amounts of stretch, because you may have differences in your hooping or your stabilizer. You may have to make adjustments. And the best thing you can do is get extra material, extra garments, and test for yourself to get a baseline. And if you have things like borders that are bigger satin borders, make sure there's another overlap and slop so the registration isn't as much of an issue. And it's just one of those things. It causes issues. Definitely want to look at other stabilization methods. You may look at also adhesion using either light embroidery spray adhesive or heat seal adhesives of some kind. There are also stabilizers that have heat seal backings on them, so you can affix them permanently so that the material doesn't move in the area of your embroidery. It depends on your tolerance for the stabilizer showing through and what you're trying to achieve. The truth of the matter is there are sometimes physically things that won't work. I had a company famously that had a big fully filled logo that had a big field of fill and then really large satin stitch letters. They used to send me mass boxes of what we called customer supplied garments that they had chosen. And invariably, we would be in there with Carhartt jackets. So it's big, cotton duck jackets, overalls, mass workwear. And then we would have a pack of burnout tees. If you don't know what burnout tee is, it's a tee that has areas of it that are chemically burned out, that are thin and gossamer and mesh. And they would want us to embroider the same logo on all of them. Truthfully, I adjusted the densities down as best I could, but some of those we just had to put a fairly decent piece of stabilizer on them. We told them ahead of time it wasn't going to look good, and we did it. The truth of the matter is, sometimes with customers who are willing to listen, they absolutely do not work that way. You cannot get what you want for all of them. Sometimes the best thing you can do is actually redesign your logo or look at your logo and say, can I use something lighter that makes more sense for the garment? Because it's holistic, as I often say. And I do love this. Jeff says, I'm sitting here nodding like you can see me. Love the explanation. Learned something new. Good. I'm glad I actually taught something new today. But also, Heidi says that would be an awesome series talking about analyzing designs. Let's look into that. Let's talk about it for sure. And here's the thing. My software asked me for different garments to embroidering. Does it actually change density or stitching on? Some do, some don't. Some are going to give you advice, and some actually will do things like adjust densities, adjust pull compensations. I'm going to be controversial and say this. Yes, they are helpful, especially for beginners. I think that you will, if you embroider long enough and digitize long enough, develop a feeling for about how much compensation you need when you see the garment, touch the garment, work with the garment, and you're going to change those to settings anyway. Do they help? Yes. And especially because a lot of the software, they have gone to some extensive work to say what kind of stabilizer should you use or something, and those stabilizer choices are usually pretty good. So that's one of those things. So one of those works that you kind of work with is that you know that these are general, though. Here's the issue. It's like automation to some degree. Can be helpful where it makes sense and where it doesn't take away your creative control. If we lean on it too hard, especially, we have to think that, hey, like stock designs too. Stock designs are made for I wouldn't say ideal, but for one kind of material to work perfectly that is in the middle of stretchiness, thinness, thickness, loft, and texture. For me, when I made stock designs, I've said it a million times, it was always a cotton piqué polo. If it ran well and looked good and outlines all showed up exactly where I wanted them on a cotton piqué polo with one layer of cutaway, I was good. One layer of medium cutaway and cotton piqué polo with a little bit of texture on it. If I can make that run on a stock design, I'm going to hand that stock design off to somebody. The thing is, if they put it on quilter's cotton, it's probably too heavy. They put it on fleece, it probably doesn't have quite enough coverage. They put it on basket weave, it might have another issue. So a couple things. First, I'll go ahead and the one that didn't make me crack up. Lisa says, great idea to use a Hive approach on different graphics. I'm sure you get a wide variety of samples to chat about. I'm giggling a little bit about that because I know Lisa and I both, sometimes we have people who want us to do their homework. I don't want to say this in a bad way, but there are times where someone says, they want some tips, but instead of tips, what they actually ask you for is can you digitize this in front of me? And most of us are not going to have time to do that, folks. But, there will be lots of people who probably offer some samples up. What I'll say is, if you send me art, the thing that I might also do is look at the art and then show you something I've already done that's in the ballpark so we can talk about it. But I do very much love what Ramona says here. She's laying out my to-do list, which is what cracked me up. Eric's to-do list: publications, location, artwork and digitizing decisions, and get that third hand ordered. Yeah. Believe me, when the robot hand comes in, this is going to be so nice. So nice when I get the robot hand. I will, Dr. Octopus, I will have multiple hands. I will be running through the embroidery shop. I'll be hooping while I run and while I digitize. I'm all about it. Post-human, cyborg, let's do it. Like I said, Ghost in the Embroidery Machine being the title of my my articles over at MrHeadstitch.com. And yeah, this is absolutely true. Josh says, not all stabilizers are the same on Cutaway and Tearaway. No, absolutely not. They are not the same. And the truth of the matter is, I like to find one that I really love and work with it and learn to adjust for it. Absolutely true. I will say this. Most of my work is made for one medium layer of Cutaway. I prefer having a cutaway in most things. People say, there's always the rhyme, if you wear it, don't tear it. That's a fine thing to say. Might not be really enough, folks. So it's one of those things that people say, if you wear it, don't tear it. I don't know. That's not always the case. You can get away with it. There are people who run tearaway on certain things. And it also depends on the design. The design is light, has a lot of open area in it, isn't going to pucker. You could probably run tearaway on it and then very carefully tear it away. The problem is some materials also don't hold up to it. You'll be tearing the layers apart and you'll tear a hole in the material because it can't take the force that it takes to rip the tearaway off. It's one of those things. Jose says, thanks for this. I'm learning to digitize for my detailed artwork, and there's great info where I should and shouldn't do. My goal is to embroider detailed pinups. Work on the face. If you can do anything for people, work on the face. The face is the first thing that people notice. And if the face is wrong, we all notice it immediately as human beings. It's like an evolutionary thing. If the face is wrong, we know something's up. So work on your faces and lighten things where you can. Be careful on the eyes. Open up the eyes bigger than you think they need to be, and use little detail. Also, don't worry that there are straight lines around things that look like they're round when they're really small in the finished piece. You forgive a lot of those straight lines. So I had to say that. Fanny says, great. I just bought 10 yards of piqué polo for testing. Like I said, it's a good middle range thing to test on. A little bit of difficulty, a little bit of loft, a little bit of texture. I like it that way too. So let's see this. All right, so you're totally right on the floating technique. I try it and always go back to hooping. As long as hoop clarity, you can't go wrong. I feel the same way too. That's kind of how I feel about it. It really depends on. There are reasons to float. Let me clarify one thing before we go on. It looks like bonus time will be borders, and then we'll actually get to this. I think we're going to do stitch selection another time, folks. I'm just going to say that now. I'm sorry about that. That was a lot of what's in the links list. I think we may even carry that to next week, and that might just be what we do. But let's talk briefly about that, and then we'll go on to the borders real fast in our bonus time sessions. I know this is supposed to be an hour-long show. It almost never is. But here's the thing with floating. There are reasons to float. Reasons I think are okay to float a garment. If you have material that absolutely will be crushed and damaged by the hooping process, I still sometimes sandwich it between two layers of stabilizer and cut a hole in the top where the window method, where my embroidery should go. But using that method, sometimes if you have something that's like velvet that will crush, if you have a very light material. I've also done heirloom pieces. I don't like machine embroidering on super fragile heirloom pieces. I've had some people beg until I embroidered on heirloom handkerchiefs for bridal stuff. Some of that stuff is so light that despite the fact that I want to do that, I did things like baste the outside edge and hoop it, or use adhesives to stick down the material I was working on until I was finished. That's a reason to float. Things that just don't hoop or you don't have a jig for. Now, these days, certainly more and more people can get things like name tape or dog collar jigs and hoops. If you see, ZSK has an incredible range of robot arms and hoops and clamps and hoop tech. And there's a million kinds of hoops and clamps that when I first started weren't there. When I first started working, if you didn't make a weird jig for yourself, mostly what we had are round hoops. That's all there were. And so if I was working on something that was not going to fit in one, like a strap or a collar or a tie or something where I wasn't going to get anywhere near what I needed to work on it, there I would probably float, adhere with some adhesion of some kind, like I said, light embroidery specific spray tack, and often baste. Stitch it down with big, light, open stitches on the outside edge, especially if the garment or the material in question would take a steaming and then have the little holes steam out. If you guys don't know, you leave holes from that stuff, it does help. But, Floating can have usefulness. And also, I'll say this, on some garments, on some materials, the material is stable like iron. On some canvas, tote bags, denim jackets, stuff like that, you may elect to float because it doesn't fit in the hoop, and they're so stable that if you stitch a nice global underlay underneath or stick them down frequently enough, you may find that they don't distort that much because it's just the forces that the embroidery puts on them, it isn't enough to distort the material. When that's the case, maybe not the worst deal. For me, 100%. If I can hoop, I'm going to hoop. Now, this includes clamping, this includes magnetic hooping, this includes any number of things that will hold the thing in a frame of some kind. So this isn't like excluding other things that aren't traditional hoops, traditional ring hoops, but mostly I'm going to hoop. And one of the other things I'm going to say truthfully, and once again, controversial because not all machines, especially home and hobbyist machines, have a tendency to have a lot of rectangular hoops. If you pull on fabric in a rectangular hoop, it's tight in the corners and it's loose on the sides, top and bottom. If I have a choice, especially in the commercial world, and I have a round hoop, I want to use a round hoop. Round hoop has tension all the way around the edge equally. If we're the magnetic hoop, however, magnetic hoops have magnets all along those sides and top. You have tension all the way around, because it's clamped at several locations. But when we're dealing with rectangular hoops in a standard format, especially on the home machines, a lot of them have very little tension top and bottom, side to side. And so I will say they have more tension in the corners. They hold in the corners. They don't hold top and bottom, side to side. And really light materials can bunch and still pull in the middles when that happens. So, all right, yeah, one topic out of 3 with the hour down, right, guys? Let me briefly talk about borders. I think we may even have to move some of that to another time because the 3-dimensional density thing is such an issue. And once I said, I'm going to do one more little piece here. I'm going to talk to everybody one more time, then we'll jump into the last bit. But yeah, first, bonus time is always appreciated. I hope so, guys. Hopefully you're happy still listening to me for another half hour. We'll see how it goes. Marianne says, float only on a bag, but I have to tape it and babysit it, and I hate it. Yeah, clamps. I've used pneumatic clamps, magnetic hoops, and other things that hold that together. And like I said, pneumatic clamps and lever clamps for bags are awesome because they can sometimes clamp it tight enough, especially if the bag is a real stable material that you don't have to babysit it quite so much. And here's the other thing that people will not believe from me is on certain bags, I've done stuff without stabilizer. I like to use stabilizer a lot because I also think it smooths out the travel across the needle plate. Like with hats, some people will say don't use stabilizer in structured hats. I pretty much always do because there's a lot of like, seams and things that can catch on the inside of a hat on needle plates, depending on your machine. If you have machines that don't have this problem or have nice narrow cylinder arms, it's not a big issue. But in the old machines I used to run, especially, they very much had corners that things could hang on. But yeah, clamps are great for that. And yeah, me too. I love clamps. They're great and the thing is, they're great for the things they're meant to be worked with. I wouldn't use them on everything. I wouldn't probably use them on performance wear necessarily. I would use them on bags all day long. Running bags, clamps are great for bags. And Ramona says, hand needles are still your friend when you're basting. Oh, man, you better be doing boutique work where you're getting paid. But yeah, hand needles can do it. And honestly, like I said, I have used every kind of like embroidery specific spray tack. Just be careful where you're spraying and set up a little cardboard box spray booth. Cindy also says, there's my favorite word, global underlay. Yeah, global underlay is an awesome word. Brian and I both throw that around in the Brilliance place quite a bit because I think it's a useful term. Also to remember, folks, like I talked about with the underlay building up on those fills, you can underlay by yourself using your fill stitch tool or your straight stitch tool. You do not need to rely on the automatic underlay. If you do need to leave a gap for something for some reason and the underlay is kind of crazy running around the gap, turn off the automatic underlay and draw in your own stitches that still do what they need to do. And underlay primarily supports top stitches. So wherever your stitch angle is, if your underlay is perpendicular to that stitch angle and each of these stitches lands on maybe 2 rails of underlay, now it's supporting that from the top and supporting that top stitching with the underlay structurally. You can make your own out of a light density fill. You can make it in multiple parts when you need to. You can do part of it manually and part of it automatically. There are multiple ways to handle underlay. You don't have to let the software do it all for you, especially when you're doing something that's special and weird and problematic and that you usually do. It's okay to have to do that stuff. And last couple of comments here. Jose says, so true with the eyes. When I first started on a small scale, my eyes looked like they were sucked in by black holes. This right here. I have judged digitizing contests, and this was the primary reason I threw out really beautiful designs because they were bad for production, because they would break thread in the eyes. Now I do 12 by 8 designs and try not to overdo it on the eyes. Lighten up your details, folks. Every line that's in the art does not need to be in the embroidery. We want to intimate this stuff, and it's supposed to be judged, especially when it's apparel, from like 3 feet, and now these days 6 feet to social distancing, but the handshake distance is at least 3 feet apart. Remember that you're judging it from 3 feet, not from 3 inches. And when your customer does that, tell them to stick their hand a little further out. Jeff also says about the cap thing. I've torn a seam on a hat before because the stabilizer didn't cover it. I had to use a 20% piece of stabilizer, then have to replace a hat. And if you're on a multi-head machine, then have to stop a machine running and mess with your run. So yeah, stabilizer's cheap compared to errors and ripped up hats, especially the kind of hats that people are buying these days. They are expensive, some of these hats. So certainly think about that, folks. But yeah, stabilizer is meant to do its job. Let it do its job. Use stabilizer when it's necessary, and don't use a tremendous amount to counteract problems that you're digitizing, or because you're using too much density, or because you're not using your pull compensation correctly. But do use the amount that it needs. I think it's fair to say that we don't want to. Saving money on stabilizer is a good way to lose money on garments. So I'll just say that I like to stabilize things correctly. Not overly, certainly not overly. Don't love multiple tons of layers of stabilizer. A lot of people will tell you to use like 5 layers of stabilizer in different configurations. Very rarely do you need to do that. Woven stabilizers you do because they have a directional grain where they stretch on the 45-degree angle. So you have to offset them by that angle and have 2 layers of that stuff for sure. But when you're into 3 or more layers of stabilizer, you should probably be asking yourself what's gone wrong. That's how I feel about it. Right. Anyway, let's bring up the software again, because I do want to talk a little about borders. It was something I really wanted to get into. People have been discussing with me lately. And here, I'm going to go ahead and do one more quote from Jeff here. He says, I think it was you who said, save money where you should, not where you can. Yeah, totally. And I think saving money on, also think about this, saving money on, if you're dealing with customers, on customer experience. If the customer's experience is great and they don't have to wait for a replacement garment and everything goes well, they're going to have a lifetime value that's larger than a customer that has to deal with you messing things up every time because you're trying to save pennies here and there. Save pennies where it makes sense, certainly. Do have a light hand in your digitizing, but don't overly worry about 100 stitches here necessarily if it's something that is going to cause a bunch of technical issues, and definitely don't worry about a piece of stabilizer if you have to use it. Anyway, let's go ahead and jump into the software one more time. I'm going to show you this piece, and actually first I'm going to go ahead and bring up the actual item. I think it makes sense to show you the image if I can. So let's go ahead and grab the image if I can show it to you real quick. Let me see. I've got this here. This is the actual hat that we're talking about. This was done as an applique. So this had a felt applique. We talked about applique last week, and this was actually cut on a plotter cutter felt applique done on a hat. It's a pretty large hat. It goes seam to seam, side to side. But what I want to talk about is this kind of double border look that we have here, and to just discuss how it's put together real briefly. And like I said, I'm going to keep that pretty brief because I think we may have to do this as part of another show as well. But let's go ahead and take a look at it. I want to run you through it. First thing I want to say is this. People will show me lettering, and especially when the lettering is separate. We're going to get to that again in a second. What they often do is embroider each letter's border entirely and then try and stack them all together. Sometimes you can. Sometimes the density doesn't build up too heavily and you can stack a fully bordered letter on top of itself. Often when you have multiple color borders or you have something like this where there's areas that need to be filled, it's just not going to work. What they frequently want to do is try and fill this whole thing. When we're dealing with a tight contour like this, trying to fill the whole thing and border it, especially at the scale I am with this hat, is just not really a great option. So the first thing to recognize is the thing that I say over and over when we talk about digitizing. Just because that big red slab of border is one object on our vector art doesn't mean it should be one object in embroidery. And in fact, it almost never should be. This needs to be made up of multiple objects. Now there are some pieces when I was reviewing this that I think I would change these days, that I would actually alter it. And I'll show you the things that I would have done differently. But let me show you how it was put together, right? Let's kind of run through this thing. First of all, of course, this was this is an applique piece. So this is just showing the applique, but here's my tack down stitch, and then we start running this border. But let's just show you what this looks like, right? As this border goes on, here is one element. Yes, this is one piece. Why? None of these divots dip in tightly into the lettering, and none of the areas have too much issue. We do have some automatic cornering involved, but in general, we have one big satin piece. No problem, right? Inside here, we're going to have a filled area that is going to be bordered. I'm going to border the fill area so that I can maintain the look of that raised satin border on all of these objects. So what you're going to see here is I've actually used a nice big kind of length limit satin with a big zigzag underlay under it. Now we're going to go up here and you'll see that there's one piece of this outline, and this is what I would have changed. I would have made the inside curve of the C continuous on this piece, but you still see what I'm talking about. In order to get the look that I wanted, I went ahead and started part of the border, and then I have a secondary border around this inner counter that goes like this. And you'll see that's now 3 pieces that make that up. We're not expecting to make that out of one border. And the thing is, when we have a piece like this, I think what I would have done instead is almost like a lowercase b. I would have traced around it and come back up to the top, right? I would have gone from this point here, and I'll show it to you, and traced around it and gone back up to the top continuously. And that's something that I would have changed. But the thing still remains, when you need to go down into a tight corner or an area where 2 borders overlap, sometimes you break out and have a single satin stitch instead of splitting into 2 satin stitches just because it's between 2 different letters. Let's go ahead and just run through this real quickly again. And you can see that I'm starting to do the bottom here and trace back through. And you'll see that I went ahead and traveled around because I wanted to have as much of that border continuous as I could. And these little pieces that go inside, instead of having the border go in and back out, as you can see, when I get to these tight little areas, I break the border into pieces, and I have a single satin stitch that covers this area where multiple borders might have intersected. And then we go back and start to cover all these little areas. We go back forth, and we get all the pieces done and pieced out, right? Now, I'm going to say this sequence is a little weird. What I'm going to tell you is that this particular piece of felt applique on this unstructured hat, I had to do some really non-standard stuff to keep it shifting in the hoop the way you'd want to do. Usually, I would be bottom up, center out on everything. This particular applique hat on this machine, I'm telling you, it acted very strangely. We had a lot of waves and ripples, and I was getting some registration errors. And I changed the way I was running it to kind of combat the movement I saw on the machine. Not a standard look. So admittedly, there's some stuff there to look at. But see this too, where we're going up inside of this bottom of the R, I go up with 1/2 of that border and come back and run a second half on top of it. I'm not using one segment that goes up and down and doing automatic pieces. I'm going ahead and cutting it off early and then jumping in and filling in the narrowest spot with 1 satin stitch so that I don't have excessive buildup and so that I can make the shape the way I want it to look. And same thing here. I did the top on the top in one piece. I'm not using one piece of the border to make it travel around to the corner. I actually went ahead and made my own mitered corner where I turned out toward the side and then digitized the last piece separately. But it still stands. You can also see the same thing here. As we go to the borders here, right? We get up to this top. The last piece is centered out more because that's where it started to make sense to spread it back out after we were having all these shifting issues with the applique. But we'll see this. The first section goes here, and as we go down into that little tiny divot where we go between the tail and the F, I've made a single satin stitch here. Now I have a single satin stitch, and there's another segment that goes up to the top, and now I have a single satin stitch that creates that little tiny sort of insert that's in the ball terminal that goes around the ball terminal. That little kind of crotch at the top of the F gets covered with that piece. And you'll see that when we come down here, we're bordering, we're going up, doing the same thing again on this F. And over, what you're going to see is I've built them out of several pieces. And only when I have a wide enough area and I want the texture to show a separation between the two, do I use 2 pieces of satin to specifically try and make a division line to make texture there where I want it. Otherwise, I'm using a single satin to make it work. And as you can see here, this is where it starts to get less complicated. So I can run back to the top. But where I go down into a narrow spot between 2 letters, I'm frequently going to stop. And you'll see here again, this is a little narrow divot between these 2 strokes. I jump down and make a single piece, and then I go ahead and border on top of that. Now, this is another thing I would have changed. I think in this design, I was trying to maintain that bordered look. I might not have done this type of run where I went ahead and filled a central satin stitch and then bordered it. I might not have done that. I might have made it 1 satin stitch, but it did make the texture look a little funny. Everything had its own separate border that lifted it up. So I tried to go ahead and go with that to try and get that texture to stay similar. But you can see that that's the same kind of thing I did all the way around. When I had enough room, I left it alone. But when I go down, like once again, in here, because this overlaps, instead of overlapping and doing the entire tail and then going back around on top of it to finish, I ran up with a traveling stitch and did a separate section and then came down with another piece of border. Same thing here, where we're up in that kind of, I know it's a weird word, but it's a word we usually use for lettering. In the crotch, in the R, where the leg comes together, you'll see that instead of making 2 pieces, I jumped up and did a single piece out so that we didn't have quite that buildup and the textural issues. So this is just one way to look at it. Because you have a border, it doesn't mean that that border needs to be one piece. You definitely want to look at what that texture says to you about the design. You can kind of see that I favored heavily having textural edges and borders because I wanted to make it look like we had this structure on the piece. And you'll see also that I selected things I wanted to call out and brought them to the front. If you look at this design here, the dot on the eye, that satin stitch sits on top of all the others. That's intentional. I had to do some kind of work with the way that the sequence worked to make that happen, because that lowercase I has a lot of character, and it really sets itself up to look nice. Instead of having multiple random chunks in here, I wanted a nice continuous border. And like I said, in the red here, if it wasn't red on red, I would have been more worried about it. I think I would have changed that border to get that texture looking nicer. But as you see, there's so little of it showing that I just went ahead and filled this with a straight single satin stitch here and then broke out that separate border. So it's something to look at there. And, there's a couple different ways to handle that, but it's something I think that I know it's another baseball tail text. This is one where the border is underneath it rather than on top of it, but it still stands to be kind of the same order. Often when you're dragging down into these small areas between letters, it makes sense, especially at the smallest area where we're starting to get really dense on top of each other here, that we put in a single satin stitch piece instead of running both of the borders into the end and having them really bunch up and have a lot of stitch penetrations in the end. Because usually you only have a few stitches down here that are uncovered anyway. Let's go ahead and see if we can run this. I think that this one might be a little harder to see, but we'll go ahead and walk through it. You'll see that I've got an underlay. This is a specifically digitized manual global underlay to try and set that hat down and spread it out. We went ahead and attached that crown to the stabilizer. And then as we go back in, you'll see I'm starting to center out more on this piece, but we went ahead and did the top of this tail separately. Instead of overlapping everything, you'll see, once again, here we have that tail where instead of running things on top of each other, it was getting really tight, and I also knew I was going to run text and another color up on top of it. I went ahead and made a single satin stitch piece to kind of make the horn where those two come together. And the same thing happens often here. This one is not done that way, but it's done where I stopped, and in the overlap, I cut out the little piece of overlap because I knew we were doing multiple layers on top of each other, and then jumped down. And you'll see this continues to happen. This one just has a mitered corner, nothing really major there. That has one of those slugs that connected single piece of satin stitch instead of letting the border track in and out. And we'll see there again, has that little slug. And then this one actually does go around because we have a wider area there, and I want to see the texture of the two overlap layers all the way up to that spot. And because it kind of opens up into the bottom of this K. Once again, we go up into this one. This one does have a mitered corner instead. Same thing here, let that one go around. We're on that large letter. But when we get to the bottom here, we have a really tight spot where there's no way I'm going to see all that texture. I have another one of those slugs. It's just a single piece of satin stitch instead of overlapping the whole way down. So when you find you're hitting a lot of excess density and issues for overlapping individual letters and putting it all together, you can stop and make these slugs. And also remember that if you're covering an area with stitching that's coming up later, you sometimes can leave pieces out and it's not very visible. And in fact, I often do that. This particular piece had a little bit of shifting, and I wanted to make sure it had some kind of, it was a little bit more foolproof if it shifted a little tiny bit in the hoop on the hat. But I did do these little slugs to make sure I had nice overlap between the two strokes they were next to and didn't have that excess stitch penetration points because I knew I was going to have them in the final run of the text. So as you can see, once we get done with this, once again, little slugs, we have, and this is where I have a single, at this size, I have a single satin stitch that forms the inner outline of the E because I don't have room to be putting multiple pieces in there and I don't want it to be too heavy. So I just made a slug that goes inside. Same thing here. There's that slug that goes on that is extra wide to leave a lot of room for overlap for the final narrow piece of that E. Then we go down to the bottom. Let's go ahead and run through the top as well. You can see here how the strokes kind of come together. Pretty standard. You will see I've done some work to get the satin stitch to line up the way you want and to have the overlaps the way you want for texture. But as you can see, knowing that I had to put a lot of stitches in these areas that are down here and that I had these curves that are going to have tight density on the inside of the tight curve, I tried to remove the excess penetration points by using those slugs of solid satin stitch that were one piece instead of just allowing there to be borders overlapping all over the place. So once again, another early piece of mine. So it's not the tailed stuff that usually has a lot of this. These kind of brush script logos kind of went out of vogue for a little while. And during that point, I didn't have as much to show. So some of these things are pretty early. And here's another one. Like I said, some of these are not my ideal way I would do things every time, or that I could look at them and say there's different choices I could have made. But I think that they still kind of show the construction and show you what I was looking to work with and what I was doing to try to combat these issues. This is another one, ARVC volleyball. I believe I've got a photo of this one as well. Let me go ahead and see if I can show you that too on here. I believe we have that. This is the ARVC logo, and this is on some fairly heavy bags. I think there's a little more, I've got a little kind of slop here that I don't love. There's a little bit of texture down here that was a little funky. But on these bags that had a lining that was really grippy. They tend to grip the needle a lot, and sometimes that caused a little weirdness and deflection. I think that this area has a little bit of texture I don't love, but that's me getting under the microscope. It doesn't need to be a problem. I think that these, honestly, when you looked at them finished on people, they looked great. I will say, as usual, issues with tie-off stitches. Sometimes you have little issues with those, that they make little dents, things like that. I tend to, on things like this, sports bags where they're going to get a lot of wear and tear, I'm pretty careful with making sure things are tied off so that they don't unravel. But hey, they don't always turn out exactly how you want them to. Let's go ahead and actually take a look at the design itself, and I'll show you again how this border was constructed out of parts and pieces, and it's not messing with every single thing. Yes, there are overlaps here, but there are places where I've elected to take the overlaps out and make custom shapes. So let's go ahead and run through this also. First, you're going to see global underlay. So everybody for whom that's a favorite word, there you go. I've laid out an underlay to tack down this design, this material underneath the design before it runs. Then you're going to see that I've run some of the interior slugs first, because I wanted those to be in place before I started working on the border. And then I worked back out. You'll see in the center of the C, instead of letting the border track all the way around and having a hook all the way around and having a hole that doesn't support, we wanted to fill the area. And in this particular piece, I wanted it to be satin stitch. I didn't want a big fill under the whole thing. We actually wanted to have more texture and have the border look like a border all the way inside. So I went in with satin stitch, but what you're going to see now is that then I ran this border on top, and that border does have a split in it, so it shows that texture. But between the C and the R, I stopped the border and made a piece that bridges somewhat between the two so that the overlap is not all that visible, and so that it does maintain a fairly smooth texture, so that the V, or between the V here. So the V comes down from there, and then we have a pretty standard border. But there the same thing happened here with the R. Cut that piece out and actually overlapped it underneath there, because these satin stitches had a lot of pull, and depending on the garment they were running, I would use more pull compensation on them, and they would pull quite a lot. And so I wanted to have nice big overlaps, and part of that was to not have things pulling apart in these seams. So we use another slug there. That's one piece. There's that bottom of the R. As you can see, inside that crotch of the R, instead of doing two pieces, I went in and had it pretty smooth, one big satin going down. Same thing in between here. Then we have this border that goes around, and then on the top of the R. So it seems kind of crazy, seems a little wacky, but the thing to remember is this actually has less stitching than the fill stitch I slapped underneath it before, and they did not love the lack of texture in the inside. So it really just depends on how you want to use it. Now, personally, I didn't want to mess around with anything else but what I have here. I have these nice big fat satins, and they overlap deeply with the text above so that if there's a little bit of shifting, you don't see too much of it. And because there's just a lot of pull compensation that you need to do with big satins like this. So we had these top satins on them that ran on top after the fact, and they're pretty much what you would expect. The thing is, we have a great deal of coverage. There's about a 50% overlap on these, and it ran like a dream, and it ran on everything. So it's one of those things where to have it run very cleanly, no matter what I put it on, and to give a little bit of that texture, as you can see, where the areas are there that have the full overlap, the logo itself, the text itself is largely covering the area, and you can't see the texture. Where there is texture visible, you can see it, like if I turn on points on this thing and drop this out, you'll see that where there are areas that the texture would be visible, I do have overlaps that are visible. I do have stitch penetration points to make it look like that border is continuous underneath there, but without having the double layer on it, and without having excess stitch penetration points lining up all along the inside of that edge. So like I said, depends on how you want to run it, depends on what your reasoning is, but this is how you can make a border out of something that is not in border shapes. You can make it with individual shapes. You can make it out of shapes that are not part of this border or are not a big slab of fill. You can make that happen. It just depends on how you want to put it together, and if you're trying to get texture out of it, you're trying to get carving out of it, or if you're trying to get something smoother and flatter. Like I said, when we were working on the earlier piece, we're talking about this Ahern piece. For me, big flat fill, text on top was what I wanted. I'm not looking at doing a bunch of definition in the tops and bottoms. I'm not looking at doing a tight contour, and the texture is fine. They're not looking to have any of that extra carved texture. When we were looking at the stuff for ARVC, this is going along with the sports look, the kind of mascot look where we have satin borders on everything, and where it's very common to have a multi-bordered satin piece. So same kind of a thing. Where would I, however, cut things out? And here's a couple more things to look at. Where do I actually cut things out? Where do I like to not have double densities? A couple things. Certainly, I don't like shadowing text with full copies of text, right? This piece, and actually, let me drop the underlay out from under this piece because that's not necessary if we're looking at it. Let's go ahead and drop this out and not make it visible because the color contrast is not really working for us. This has a shadow on it. And frequently enough, I'll see somebody who will take a shadow of this. And if you recognize this, yes, this is a Breaking Bad thing. Yes, it's a crew piece. I don't know if it was screen worn or not, but yeah, this is Breaking Bad, Better Call Saul stuff. So yes, but the thing is, people often will make shadowed text by taking a copy of the original text and slamming it down again. In this case, I thought that was way too much density. I don't like to do that with shadowed text. And so what you're going to see is that I generally tend not to do that. When I'm working with text like this, I'm going to actually cut different pieces for the shadow out. And you're actually going to find that sometimes I'm using different stitch angles so that I don't get interference. Rather than having these two pieces of this O pull at the same direction, right? This is horizontal. Well, then I made this piece come down at an angle so that they're not falling together and sinking in so that it doesn't look too narrow or too anemic in here. We don't end up with the top stitching falling into the bottom stitching too much. So there's things you can do when you start using separate pieces of shadow in satin stitch rather than just running it as one piece that is the same as the text. And the other thing is a lot of people will literally do a copy of the text, underlay and all, and put it right underneath or offset from the text to make a drop shadow. That can be done. Let's say if your software does take out overlapping stitches or something like that. For me, most of the time, I actually wanted to do something a little more custom than that. And I was usually trying to have something separate. So you can see here is the run that we're talking about. It is separate. It is made differently. And what you're going to find out too is that I did certain things where I revealed more or less to deal with that compensation with the pull and to deal with stitch angles. So ultimately, yeah, it's not like something you can't do to run a drop shadow like that. It's not my favorite thing to do. And usually you'll see me running something more like this. Also, you can see that what I have here are really huge satin stitches that are going to provide me plenty of cover. Those top satin stitches, if I were worried about them shifting around too much or not providing cover, that would be one thing. But if you look at the big, thick lettering that was on here, big, thick, chunky lettering, it's definitely going to provide me with enough coverage that I'm not really concerned about that. Plus, oh, and here actually, this is a pre-production piece that has something I should have seen. What I'm going to tell you guys is, if you ever hear me talk about the pre-flight check where I say take your final stitch file and open it up and run it, this is why. Because this is actually, I grabbed this out of my archive folder, and this isn't a final piece. This is a piece that was not finished. This actually has a copy and paste error where I accidentally have two copies of part of the M. You can't see that in the preview. You can see that the stitch count's weird, but that's it. Unless you actually run it through the slow run preview. If you do it through the preview panel like this, through the stitch simulator, then you can see this stuff, but you won't see it when you print it out. So something to think about with what I always call the pre-flight check. But yeah, this particular piece, I grabbed it out of my my samples that were already converted, and apparently I should have looked carefully at it. But yeah, this happens to everybody. The copy and paste problems can be there, but you'll see that there's no reason to run all of this big, heavy satin. Plus, because of the color contrast on this, I had to use a little more density I wanted to, a little more underlay I wanted to. I certainly don't want to have double that in these pieces. It's an awful lot to put together. So in my case, I wanted to change that for that. Also, here's another piece, a couple of other pieces that I'll show you real briefly. I'm not going to go through every piece I have here, but here is a piece that has a fill with satins on it. And here's the two different ways that you can handle when you have this satin over it. Most of the time, I'm not going to cut stuff out because it doesn't make sense. This one had a rather large couple of sets of satin pieces here. It had high contrast compared to the garment behind it. So it ends up where I'm dealing with a lot of color from this like brick red coming through the white. It made sense for me on these satins to pull out the the stitching. Also, if you look at the stitch angle, because of the angle being the way that it is, I'm not going to be jumping in and out of a complex shape to cut out that area. I'm only going to fill up to a line, and it's not going to do a lot of weird jumping around and traveling because it cuts all the way edge to edge from border to border through the fill. Same thing here at the top. It doesn't mess with the sequencing a lot. It doesn't mean that I'm going to have a lot of extra travel to cut that out. So let's go ahead and run through it really briefly. You'll see that this piece, because of the way the fill is constructed, fills right to the top. No extra travel, no extra weirdness. And I drop a big chunk of fill out, enough to actually make a difference to the stitch count and to reduce some of the color coverage issues of that brick red trying to show through that really pale white. So we go ahead and run this piece too. No backtracking, no issues, right? Same thing with this piece. No backtracking, no repeats. When that's the case, cutting that piece out of there might be worthwhile. I can still make a case. Even right now, looking at it, I can say, I'd have to look at the stitch count again and see if I was just being fastidious and trying to put too much work into this. You might not have had to cut it out. But you can see here, that's where it made sense. But where did I not cut it out? Underneath this narrow satin stitch. Absolutely no reason to. And when the fill started processing through all of that, the little tiny nooks and crannies that are down in here, it would have made a mess of it. So once again, I'm not going to cut out there. Same kind of thing. We can go ahead and go a couple more samples. I'll just run you through them. Here's a piece for Hockey Barn that I did, and it has another kind of underlaid text like I showed you where the outline is behind the text, the border's behind the text. And what I'm just going to show you again is really common method to handle this, and this was done on older software. The central elements in here are run first and then the border on top because we don't want to dive in and out of those little tiny tight elements. Depends on how you want to run it. But like I said, in this particular case, you'll see that those areas were done. And of course, the black behind the puck that is going through the barn is done that way as well. It's just to show you that the border is not taking, let's say, a vector of this H, making the H and then taking the vector outline of the H and slapping a satin border on it. It would have ended up with a bunch of tiny little satin stitches overlapped all in this central area because this is a hat. This is a small design. And you don't need that on this sort of scale. I believe there's a small left chest, not a hat. But in this case, still, it makes sense that you don't necessarily want that border to overlap on top of itself over and over. You can also see I have left some room because I've got a detailed little piece in the hand of this hockey player catching or the goalie catching that puck. Where that hand comes up, I want room because I've got multiple layers of satin stitches that make up the fingers of the glove and 2 more satins that make up the palm. Because of that, I'm actually leaving room in there. I'm not just overlapping stuff. I am cutting that area out. And also because it doesn't cause any weird traveling or anything. So there's that piece there. Another quick one here. Rams hockey has the same kind of thing, double outlines. We'll just run through it carefully and say, you can see once again, those central areas right there, text right there, same kind of thing. Because this has multiples, you'll see I ran it. The second one has more texture on it. By the time pull distortion happens, we do see a reveal inside that R. And there we are here. So that's how that went. And this is another thing. I'm just going to show you this briefly. It's from the show The Night Shift that was on NBC. I did a bunch of patches for them just to show you. Even this that has a little bit of fill in it, I did not cut out the background because at this size, when we're talking about a normal shoulder patch, cutting this background out of here and trying to have these other pieces, unless I made each one of these at a satin stitch, it would not have made sense. I could have cut a large section out of this and then put satin stitch parts of the border inside of here. But in this particular case, on a patch on a stable material, it made more sense just to go ahead and run over the top. Same thing with the eagle here. If you can imagine trying to have all these things going in and out and around the eagle, because all I have is a layer of light satin stitching here. Yes, even overlapped a couple times. It did not turn out too dense, especially because I use a light hand in that satin stitch. I didn't cut out that fill. What I would say is sometimes where you have enough stuff that's filled all together, occasionally you can cut out the body underneath something like this if it's all overlapped. But because we have little cutouts and areas and everything going crazy in here, the travel stitching it would have taken to make this make sense in this case, I thought made it unworthy of cutting that out. But it still is a little dense. And I'm going to admit, on a patch like this, stable material, just depends. It's not always the way that you'd want to do it, but sometimes it is. And here's another complex piece. We're going to use this for talking about stitch selection. It's a piece that I've showed you guys before. I did this for a Netflix show called Chambers. This particular one is once again, it has bordered text on it. And this one also has the borders underneath. And I'm going to answer the one last question here before we get done. But this one does have the borders underneath, but you're also going to see that these borders, these shadowed borders, are also in segments. Yes, and that big flat fill is made out of about 20 different segments to give it a carved appearance of a heart. So there we go. Also, all the feathers, of course, satin stitch overlaps. But as we get down into all of this stuff, you'll see that I've left some holes where I need to, but not everywhere, because sometimes it doesn't make sense. Where we have little areas where cutting the hole out causes more travel and more density overall, then it doesn't make sense. You will see that I have used pieces that are cut away. So there we are. Pieces are cut away where they need to be, and we have separate elements, not just a copy of the lettering with a border applied to it. So let's go ahead and answer a couple questions here before we get done. I know we are well into bonus time, so we're going to keep this short if we can. We'll do a couple more quick questions, and we'll see how it goes. Justin says, do you prefer to do borders on text first as opposed to fills with satin borders on top? No. Sometimes I'll do fills with satin borders on top. This particular run, I was answering a bunch of questions from people who had done it that way. Frequently, I will do a fully filled area of color and then do satin borders on top to define the interior elements. What I will say is, sometimes I really have a desire to have the colored element of the text be on top texturally. And in these particular pieces, I was showing that kind of look because it was fairly common, especially when I was doing mascot work, that it was preferred. Also, I will say this. Sometimes I have a very small reveal, and you'll see that really narrow satin stitches are hard to maintain compared to a satin stitch that's wider, that's overlapped by that color, and you can have the reveal on it be half of that distance, and then there's more room for shifting. Whereas when we're working with really tiny satin stitches on mascot type logos like that are going on maybe hats that don't behave very well, if I put really small satin borders on an existing filled letter, sometimes it doesn't work as well. I'll be honest and say it really depended on the design, depended on the day, depended on the garment that it was on. So I don't always prefer to do borders on text first. These particular elements, like I said, I'm answering some of these questions. You guys don't get privy to the messages that get sent to me all week long. Some of these pieces, I'm answering them because someone was showing me their work that had borders running underneath the top text. And so I'm kind of specifically answering it that way. I don't see that there's necessarily a preference. I will say that having the large overlaps means that you're working on materials that are difficult in shifting. Sometimes you can have a little more slop to it where it allows there to be a little bit of shifting. It's fine. I actually very much like a border around things, and I will do it the same way. I'll still break things up, and you'll see that a portion of the border will end where there's another overlap part of the border quite frequently. And that just depends on the particular piece. If it's a larger text where I don't have as much gap in between where it makes sense for the fill to be there, absolutely I will fill and then just define the letters by using individual, say, satin stitch elements. Still, like say inside of an E, I'll do the two little pieces inside the E. I'll do the border separately. So I've got 3 satin stitches and then do the back of the E and then attach it to the letter next to it. I will still do the same method of building the border that defines the letter out of multiple pieces. And I think that's probably the big takeaway there. So really depends on the lettering. And like I said, when we have very small reveals, like let's say we have that lettering that's really close together, but I know I want a little bit of color in between those two things. Sometimes it'll be very hard to make that maintain with a small satin, whereas I can use a larger satin underneath the letters and get the reveal from everything pulling apart and the compensation or the distortion working to my advantage. So it depends on the letter, depends on what we're working on. So yeah, I know it's a nothing answer. If we do borders again, which I think we're going to have to, I will show some samples of borders on top of text. So whoever's keeping score, whoever wants to write minutes, if you want to say what else is on my to-do list, then remind me to show you some things where the border is put on last. And I'll say definitely on larger pieces, of course. The larger the piece is, the more likelihood that satin stitch border, if I have to have it underlapping, if it has to be going underneath, underlaying the top stitch, it's going to get wider and wider and wider until it's not the kind of length I want for that border stitch. And then certainly as we get larger and larger, jacket back pieces, larger pieces, you're going to see much more of me using fill or something else for the central material and then defining the counters and the divots and the pieces between the letters as well as the border with a satin stitch on top of the fill. So larger pieces. Really depends differently. Fanny says, I see you use a lot more satin stitch with split rather than tatami for fills or not. Really depends. When I want the texture of a satin stitch, but I don't want the excess length, I will use either satins with splits, or I will use a length limit. I'll also admit, I favor the look of overlapped satins to fills to some degree. That's absolutely true. And when we're looking at text, especially the classic look of turning satin stitch text, I think is like the heart of embroidery. I love it. It's what I think machine embroidery looks like when it looks best. So I tend to favor satins. The thing is, you also can't take these 5 designs as my whole career. There's tons of fill work done over the course of my career. It really depends on what I would do in the given piece. What I'll say is I have literally, I think I sent my entire catalog to someone who needed to analyze files technically, and the entire catalog of just the one format of designs was over 16,000. So I've done a lot of designs. I would say if I have to go over my entire catalog of designs, you will see a preference for me to using split satins as long as I'm at a certain width. Once I get over, that kind of magical, I don't know, 15 millimeter line, I'm probably going to start looking at fills on the width of the stroke, but it depends. It depends greatly on what I'm looking for. A lot of people like the texture of a carved satin stitch more than a fill. And for me, I was always trying to differentiate. I worked in multidisciplinary houses where there was print and applique and embroidery all in one space, and embroidery sold on its texture and shine. If you want more shine, satin stitches and length limit or split satins tend to have more shine. And because I can change the stitch angle as I go along, instead of using a fill stitch that's one direction, I'm getting stitch angles that when you move the piece in space, you put it on a curved human being, we are all rounded. We are not big flat billboards, most of us. We end up where the light hits it at different angles as you turn and as you move, and it gives a kind of life and sparkle to the design that I appreciate. So for me, I probably do favor it, but I've done a ton of fill stuff too. So it depends on how big the area is. If you go back and look at, if I pull up the designs again and we just go back to, most of this is actually done. You'll see even in the chambers piece, a lot of it's curved fills because the curve does still give me that stitch angle appreciation. Those angles are curved. Also just splitting things into different panels of fill so that I have facets, almost like a faceted jewel, if you think about it that way, different angles of reflection of light. But you will see a lot of like split satins up in the top here, satins up in here. If an element is a columnar element, if it's something that looks like a tube or a rectangle that's narrow, I probably will do something like that in a satin. And definitely in text, you're going to see more of it. But where it makes sense, I would say when we're talking about the Ahern, most of that's fill. I'm not going to use, if this were any bigger, and when I did jacket back versions of this, I absolutely made those big fat letters into fills that had borders on them. When I get big enough, a bordered fill is nice and crisp and it looks good, and it looks better than trying to render like a turning fill. I don't usually like a standard tatami fill turning stitch angles. Not my favorite thing. So hopefully that makes sense and makes a little sense about it. Last couple pieces here goes ahead with Jose. For large pieces, it's better to cut up the design in a small section, have them stitch out piece by piece to get proper registration. Big question. Depends on the garment you're working on, depends on the design. I will say I've worked on really large jacket backs where they were shifting enough that I absolutely did this. And if you have something where the design's really detailed, you must have tight registration. Let's say something that has multiple colors and has like black outlines and straight stitch on it, or dark outlining or engraving work or shading work that has a lot of absolute fine 2-pass straight stitch outline that has to hit the target. You may break something into quadrants or do that kind of work and take the hit of efficiency of having multiple color changes, and work and finish an entire quadrant as best you can before you move on. Absolutely have done that on larger pieces. And it depends on what you say. Large pieces, if it's in the size of a left chest hoop most of the time, unless the garment is really shifty, I'm probably not going to do that. Sometimes if the garment's really shifty or the design happens to have a lot of forces on it, where if we're doing a lot of different satin stitches that move in different directions, I might have to do that. And in fact, I have a piece that I can show you guys. We're not going to bring it up now since we're so deep into bonus time, but we'll talk about Celtic knotwork again at some point. I've shown it before, a piece for a brew pub called Quarter Celtic, and it had it was complete interlaced knotwork that was 2 layers of multicolor borders on it. So this particular piece, I had to do half of a hat and do all the colors in one half, and half of the hat, all the colors in the other half. For that very reason, on super shifty hats, on really giant jacket backs, on really big art pieces that are, I'm talking about pillowcase size pieces too, especially, but jacket backs and large pieces like that, you absolutely can get better registration if you don't move all over. Because if you think about, we're working on like some 16 by 16 inch piece, and we work all in one quarter, and then we start moving up to the other one and move all the way over here and do all of one color, we've put a lot of force on this garment, and you can see the apparent direction. Like maybe we work in kind of a circular fashion. We're pushing the garment all the time that we do that. It's also why I tend to work center out even on flat pieces when I can, because we're pushing the garment around. Because you'll see as something stitches in the apparent motion of the needle, we know the needle's not moving, that it'll kind of hump up the material as the needle's moving in front of it. And you'll see that push, that motion as we sew things down. Or if we don't use global underlay and stitch down our material first or adhere it in some way, we'll find that we put a bunch of density in one quarter of the thing, and everything kind of bows away from that area of density. It pushes out in that 3D distortion. And then when we move around doing all that and we come back to that first area, we've shifted by all the different areas that we worked on, and it can cause outlines gutter restoration. So yeah, really big pieces, super shifty materials, super shifty hats. Working in one quarter can sometimes be useful. And especially we're talking about bordering a letter. We're talking about on a hat, and we have multiple borders on each letter, and they're separate, and they go all the way across the hat, or they go out into that kind of wide field zone. Running the hat border and the text and the letter at the same time, each one, can sometimes keep you from having issues with shifting, with them not lining up, and with other registration problems. So yes, sometimes you won't have to, but yes, it can absolutely help. Okay, with that, guys, we are way over time. I'm stopping right here. I absolutely did not have time for 3 topics. We will talk about selecting stitch types at another time. For those of you who are hardcore reciprocators who have stayed through the whole thing, thank you very much. Once again, if you didn't see it earlier, we do have the links list available. I'll just make sure you guys see that one more time. The links are here at the links list, so check it out at the top of the comments if you haven't seen it before, and that will allow you to get to all the articles. Like I said, most of the articles that are in here really have a lot more to do with stitch selection. But looking at pull compensation, looking at push compensation certainly helps. And by the way, I think I may have to be writing a distinct piece about borders, or maybe doing a more video on borders, absolutely, as we go on. But I'll say this, remind me about the stuff that you guys want. Hit me up in the comments and let me know, because that's something that we can definitely talk about later. And what I'll say is certainly this. Remember always that no matter how many pieces look like they are there in the art, if there's a big plane of color or there's one border, that in embroidery, it's very likely we're not going to grab that vector and just convert it over and fill it with stitches. We do our best work when we work for the embroidery, for the medium, and we make and draw the individual pieces we need so they overlap correctly, so that they have the kind of reveal that they need to have, and so that they make sense as embroidered pieces. Remember that we're going to put these things together and build a physical object out of that thread. So remember your garment, remember your distortion, remember that we're not to build up too many needle penetrations in one spot, use a light hand, and as always, get out there and stay strong, stitch on, try something out, forgive yourself ahead of time for the garment you ruin, because it's every garment you ruin is a lesson that's going to stick with you. And honestly, it's not ruined if you learn and you do something better, or you learn to do something new each day. So with that, guys, I'm happily done, and I can let you go for the weekend. But I cannot wait to have you again next week as my audience here. So reciprocators, get out there and get it done.